My name's Anthony Bale and I'm a professor of medieval literature. Welcome to my exp. In my work on medieval pilgrimage and medieval travel, it became clear to me that the island of Rhodes in the Eastern Mediterranean had a very important status in European culture. It was between East and West. It was a kind of hub of Western European culture in the Eastern Mediterranean, very close to what's now the coast of Turkey. And it was a place very familiar to people from across Europe. It was a kind of meeting point and a melting pot between Eastern and Western cultures, between what we think of as the Byzantine Empire and of the Latin Empire. Both the island and the town of Rhodes were owned and controlled by the Order of the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights of St. John. And in 1480, the Ottomans besieged the island from May to August. The siege was ultimately unsuccessful for the Ottomans, but this caused a widespread panic and outrage in Europe that the Ottomans were advancing on Christendom. So this was part of a very kind of moment of panic between Christendom and Islam around the encroaching Ottoman forces. In 1480, this was, I think, a very troubling and difficult year for Western Latin Christendom's sense of itself. There was the Siege of Rhodes, but there was also an Ottoman siege at Otranto in southern Italy, which lasted slightly longer, but was basically around the same time. There were rumours that the Ottomans could reach Rome, that this was a transformation of a geopolitical balance of power and centres of power in Europe. Since the fall of Jerusalem in the late 12th century, Western Christendom had often defined itself against a certain kind of Islam, which was based in the Mamluk Empire, but did not have a territorial claim on the West, or did not encroach on the West. With the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the cataclysmic fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the subsequent shift of power to the Ottomans, Christendom has to start thinking of itself as actually a shrinking entity. By this point, after 1453, Byzantium is a tiny, really not an empire at all. It's a tiny rump of itself, and it's very dispersed, but also so are the Venetian and Genoese islands, and what's now in other parts of Eastern Europe, in what's now Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, Ukraine, the Ottomans had also made very, very significant territorial gains. Christendom starts to think of itself as under attack, as the smaller, weaker force. Don't forget at this point as well that the Ottomans have very sophisticated military strategies and weapons, and things connected to the Ottoman Empire and to the East more generally: carpets, fabrics, jewellery, spices, things like pitch and alum. These are standard goods traded to the West that the West wants and needs. They're very desirable, they're very expensive. The Ottomans then start to control very important trade and pilgrimage routes. I think we can think of the Ottoman Empire at this point as the superpower. The propaganda really is about what unites Christendom, and the Knights Hospitaller have a really important role in this as a transnational or supranational organisation. In effect, the knights are actually, at this point, largely French and are very close to the French crown, but that's not the kind of official story of them. But yes, the propaganda is about how do we unite against the common enemy, which is Ottoman Islam, and part of that process is identifying what it is about that enemy that they feel they need to unite against. In the Middle English account of the Siege of Rhodes by John Kay, it's one of the first, possibly the first, use of the word news in English to mean reports of recent events. So this is a transformation in what writing is about. Lots of medieval writing is concerned with old events, with established events, with authoritative events. In the later 15th century, we start to see writing concerned with more current, more recent events. So there's, I think, a broader cultural transformation. This has often been attributed to the printing press, which is introduced in England in the 1470s, but is obviously spreading in Europe from the 1450s, and the speeding up of mediation of writing. I slightly take issue with that. I think actually this is also to do with a public appetite for shocking, newsworthy, strange, unprecedented events. There were various written versions of the Siege of Rhodes. The most popular one was by Guillaume Coursin, who had been a participant and an eyewitness at the siege as a senior hospitaller, and he wrote a Latin account of the siege very, very shortly after it had been concluded, celebrating the hospitaller victory, and it was very, very widely dispersed. It was partly dispersed through printed editions in several different countries and in several different languages, sometimes in manuscript, and sometimes in translations. My main source in England is John Kay's edited translation of Coursin's text. This amplifies various parts of the text, adds a preface, describes Kay's own reading of the siege as what he calls news, and as a kind of marvel, and he presents it to the English king, Edward IV. What's clear is that the Hospitallers more generally, and the d'Aubusson family and Coursin, they wanted to spread the news of what happened in Rhodes as widely as possible and in various different media. This painting, an épinay, was commissioned probably for Notre Dame in Paris, shortly after the siege, as an ex voto, as a thanksgiving description of what happened. And it's a very interesting source because it obviously is seen from the victorious Hospitallers' viewpoint, but it also shows Rhodes in a way that's recognisable to someone visiting the city today. On the left-hand side of the image, you can see a very large number of Turks fighting the knights, and that's where historically the Ottomans breached the walls. These incredible fortifications the Hospitallers had built, and you can see there the Ottomans penetrating the walls, and that's historically where the weakest point in the walls, or where the walls came down to meet the sea. The Imager épinay has a Latin inscription which is actually taken from the main written account at the time. And this image was finished by 1483, so within 2 or 3 years of the ending of the siege. And this describes how Antoine d'Aubusson was this incredibly brave man, and he went to fight this huge number of Ottomans. Between 70 and 100,000 Ottoman soldiers are thought to have taken part in the siege against a much smaller Hospitaller force. And This is actually a religious image because it describes how the Ottomans managed to penetrate the walls, and it was only thanks to a terrifying image of Jesus, John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary that the Ottomans were so frightened of this amazing miracle, this marvelous intervention, that some of them were converted, some of them fled in terror. So this is actually thought of as it's both a political image celebrating the role of the d'Aubusson family, but it's also a religious image giving thanks to God for this providential intervention, which then sealed the victory for the Hospitallers. Because in the Middle Ages we don't have a huge number of sources, but we have various competing sources, we can see in quite a lot of detail which particular agents and actors are trying to control the news, current affairs, and the horizon of what is news and what is reported. So you can actually locate that with particular people like Caussin and the d'Aubusson brothers and John Kay. You can also then tie that to institutions, including printers, universities, royal families, who have vested interests. So you can reconstruct in quite a lot of detail who has the interest in the news, who has the means to produce the news, and you can locate that in particular moments, in time, in cities, in political contexts. I think at the moment we feel like the internet, and particularly fake news on the internet, exists in this enormous, anonymous infinity of tidings and reporting and words and things which cannot ever be located with any agency or any particular specificity. Whereas with this medieval example, we can find out who's actually controlling the news agenda in a particular place and time.